Right. Hello, everyone. How are you today? On behalf of my team, I take this opportunity to welcome all of you who have joined for this wonderful webinar, who have marked their time today for this wonderful webinar on sales growth framework. I understand that we have participants from all across the country as well as from different parts of Africa as well. So I take this opportunity to welcome you. My name is Akash Borse. I represent this organization called as Faber Infinite, where we help organizations on profitability improvement. So obviously we'll go into details of this wonderful framework, which has been helping several of our clients. Today, when we are talking about sales growth, I understand that all of you might be wondering that how one framework would fit all industries, all domains. I would want to share that, of course, this framework is applicable across different industries, different walks of life. I understand that all of you would be from different domains, sizes, segments, geography. This framework is applicable. What you need to do is you need to pick and customize what suits your setup and your way of working. Today, what we'll try and do is we'll try and get at least one key takeaway from today's discussion, which will change the way you approach sales. So I promise that we will ensure at least one key takeaway for each one of you. Similarly, when I'm talking about those key takeaways, we will definitely look at actionable, implementable solutions. So all this framework that is going to talk about is implementable actions, because that's what we take pride as well. Whenever we are working on site on profitability improvement, whether that is on revenue growth or cost management, we work on the real field. So that's why all these solutions would be implementation oriented. Right. So with that note, let's move on to the webinar. The subject that we have today is grow your organizational sales by 33% in 11 months. Sounds really interesting and encouraging when we are talking about those numbers. I would want to mention here that obviously as a setup, a sales mechanism that you would be having, you would be growing at a regular pace. I would want to share that this particular numbers are on top of what you're doing right now. So these are indicative numbers. There have been cases that we have achieved more than this in several cases. In here, we are talking about 33%, which is indicative. There could be situations where you achieve more, a little less. But then the whole process that we are talking about, accelerating the sales, accelerating this process of achieving higher numbers. So how do we do it? One very important thing that I would want to tell you, again, I would want to reiterate at the cost of repetition, I'm saying that, yes, this is possible for your organization as well. So it doesn't matter which organization you belong to, whether you are into B2B setup, B2C setup, whether you are from rural area or urban area, it doesn't matter. It is equally applicable across different industries. So what we'll do is we'll also look at some examples, live examples, how this framework can be implemented. Okay, so before we jump on to the how part, there is something precursor that I wanted to discuss with all of you. One is when we are talking about growing sales, it doesn't mean that when we are talking about growing sales, the economy is growing as well. Even if the economy is growing, it's wonderful, it is going to be a big boost. But even if the economy is not growing, still these concepts are equally applicable. So when we are talking about growing sales, we are not talking about customers queuing up outside your shop. We are talking about how do you encourage those customers and consumers reach out to you, right? And of course, selling has never been easy. So selling was, is, and will always be a challenge. As a team, our role when we are working towards increasing sales, our role is to how do we ensure that we reach out to our right customer and ensure that we are able to cater to his or her requirement, which is going to serve our purpose as well, right? So in general, what businesses needs to do is we need to tick those right aspects, right buttons in order to grow business and obviously grow business sustainably. So that is something that we need to ensure when we are talking about sales growth, right? So without wasting much time, today I'm going to introduce you to this entire framework. But what we will do is we will split it into different pieces. We will talk one element at a time. So that's where I would start off with. So there are 6 different drivers. So over the course of time, when we have implemented these concepts in the real field, what we have done is we have identified few drivers. To make it simple and easy to understand, what we have done is we have split them into 2 different types. So one is the external driver and the other one is internal driver. So what you see on the right are external drivers and left are the internal drivers. Now, why we call it external is because there are many facets and many parameters of external driver which is related to the market, to the customer, to the market. So that's where those are external drivers, what we need to look at, which are like outside the organization. And when we are talking about internal drivers, those are within the organization. So that's where, that's the broad bifurcation. What we will do over the course of this another 15-20 minutes, we'll be going into details of each and every driver. Obviously, each driver are further detailed into sub-elements, sub-drivers. So that is what we'll be touching upon today. So starting with the first one, when we are talking about customer needs, that is something fundamental when we are talking about identifying those drivers and taking it further. So if I were to talk about customer needs, it is further detailed into identifying what my market opportunities are. Based on my understanding of those market opportunities, how am I going to design my sales strategy? How am I going to approach the market? And finally, once I have designed that, it talks about how am I going to brand and market my product, service, offering, whatever you call it, the way you have been. So how am I going to reach out to the customer once I have identified those needs? So when I'm talking about identifying those market opportunities, it goes as fundamental as once I have the product, what purpose this particular product or offering is going to serve. For example, I'll go back to a live case where we were working for one of our clients. That was into processed chicken. Now, all its life, as in during its existence, it was catering to frozen market. I'm talking about a client in East Africa when it was addressing the frozen chicken market. Whereas there was equal potential or rather larger potential in the fresh domain. It was not that the client was not aware. The client was aware about this opportunity as well. But then making it realize, unlocking the real potential was missing. There were a lot of bottlenecks. There were a lot of issues in the entire value chain for the client to address and reach out to fresh chicken market. So that is something, once it is identified, that's where we get into the detailing of how are we going to realize that particular potential. So from 20% capacity utilization, it went up to 100 and I would say around 80% utilization. So from around 40 tons a month, it went up to 180 tons a month as well. So here what we are trying to do is we are trying to unlock the real potential which exists in the market, and obviously the potential is much higher. You can scale it further as well. Now in here, by virtue of moving from frozen to fresh, obviously you're catering to the market in a much better way. You're improving your entire value chain. You're also working on the costs because there is a certain amount of cost associated with storing the chicken as well. So what I'm trying to say is identifying the real potential which is there, identifying what the market opportunities are. On similar lines, if I were to talk about a different example altogether from a different industry, let's talk something about the pharma industry. I understand that when we are talking about a pharma industry and typically sales growth in pharmaceutical industry, there is this very famous parable which is very popular, which talks about once one of the very large multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical manufacturing company, they hired a consulting company consulting organization in order to improve their sales. Now in here, when the detailed analysis, the detailed study was done not only in the factory but also in the real sales field, it was a very exhaustive, extensive study which was conducted. Finally, what came out of that particular study, obviously there were a lot of observations, but one fundamental observation which was talking was that when it comes to the sales rep of that particular organization, pharmaceutical company, they were also making the measuring, monitoring different number of calls and the conversion rate and all of that. Each and every individual was making. But then one very important observation was that when you're targeting your customer, in this case, the doctor who's going to prescribe those medicines, how about making and identifying or profiling the doctors in an early age group? So that is something was very starking recommendation to identify the market opportunities. And once if you target the younger doctors, your lifespan for the medicine or the lifespan for the doctor to prescribe those medicine is much larger. So that's where identifying where the real opportunities lies. Once you have identified, the next part comes in the sales strategy. How are you going to cater to those opportunities? So that's where you get into the detailing of what channel or means of reaching out to market, whether it would be through a typical dealer distributor network, or you would want to get into mechanism which is reaching out directly to the consumer via e-platform or online platform. So all of that measurement and the real channels that you would want to approach comes in later once you have identified the opportunities. So that is one of the first driver is when we are talking about identifying the customer needs and tweaking your approach to the market accordingly. So on that note, obviously we can go into details of this subject in due course. We will have further detailing of each and every driver. Let's move on to the next one when we are talking about competitive analysis. Now in here, typically when we are talking about competitive analysis, everyone refers to Kotler, which talks about the 4 P's of marketing, and today that has graduated to even 7 P's. So I'll not go into details of those 7 P's or 4 P's. Obviously, those being pricing, packaging, promotion, placement, whatever it is. What I would want to highlight is once you have conducted your competitive analysis, as in who are your competition in the market and how you would want to be placed as compared to the competition, you need to identify what are those key points which you need to take for you to reach out and excel. Like for example, let me take one very interesting case. These days in India, there is a very popular perfume brand called as Fog. When they rolled out into the market, in the deodorant market in the country, they were actually priced higher than the big boys of deodorant industry, which were already existing. So as a new entrant, it was surprising for the market analyst that how can you do this? But there was a detailed study which was done when it comes to the distribution or the placement of the product. We are talking about, there was this detailed analysis was done that if I need to capture 80 to 90% of the market in terms of the reach, I'm talking about only 16 cities, 16 cities where I need to take care of, in which I need to ensure that my products are available. So along with the entire marketing campaign, which was very thoughtfully designed, once that was rolled out, it was ensured that the entire supply chain was in sync to ensure that the product is reaching those 16 cities at different places. Right. So it is very important when we are talking about competitive analysis to look at the 4 P's and ensuring that the product or offering is reaching to the right consumers. We move on to the third driver, which typically is talking about the value proposition, what value your product or offering is delivering to the customer. Now in here, this is kind of a bridge between the external world and the internal driver. So as in the internal driver and external driver, this element makes a bridge there, because what we are trying to do here is, typically when we are talking about value proposition, there are 3 different facets to it. One is the feature of your offering, the advantage that your feature is going to deliver to the customer, and finally the benefit. Now there is a very thin line of difference between the advantage and benefit. I'll go into details of it. And before I get into the details of it, I would want to mention that it is very classical, fundamental when it comes to selling. And there have been mentioned that selling is something which is an art. There is a school of thought which says selling is a science. So whether you go back to any of the sales coach, even our sales coach here at Faber Infinite, we have been getting into details of it, and our coaches have been talking about what value proposition that your offering is offering to the market, as in terms of feature, advantage, and benefit. So it is very fundamental to selling. So in here, when we are talking about feature, advantage, and benefit, I would want to explain this with a very simple example. Let's say when I'm talking about a watch, whether that is a Titan or a Rolex, it doesn't matter. So if I'm talking about a Swiss watch, and if you're selling the Swiss watch into the market, you're talking about it being Swiss made is a feature of that particular watch. Now, instead of selling those features, what you need to ensure is you're talking about the advantage and benefit of that feature. So if it is a Swiss made watch, it will always run on time, as in it will never stop or it will never get delayed. It would be very accurate. So that will ensure the advantage of that is using that particular watch, you would always be on time, right? The benefit is something that you would be customizing to suit your customer. It has to be something customized. So in here, you would be talking about what benefit it would be if you're reaching on time. Let's say if you're reaching on your as in on time for all your meetings, all your customers are going to respect you in terms of the values that you carry, right? So similarly, it is very evident whether you are into a B2B market or B2C market, how are you customizing your features into benefit for the customers. So if I were to take, there are several such FMCG companies in terms of where they take advantage of this particular element. So if I were to talk about another beautiful kitchen brand called as Prestige, so since ages they have been running this campaign where they have been talking about if you love your wife, you gift her a Prestige kitchen appliance, right? So you're customizing it to the last mile. So that's where feature, advantage, and benefit comes into picture when we are talking about the third driver, which is the value delivered, value proposition. So with that, what we will do is we move on to the internal drivers, starting with the first one, which is the sales team SWOT analysis. So when we are talking about the sales team analysis, obviously there is one analysis which talks about whether I have the right sized sales team. So when I'm talking about this exponential or accelerated sales growth, obviously one element comes in where I have the right sized sales team. So there is a detailed analysis which one needs to conduct on the field, in terms not only in terms of the numbers, but in terms of qualitative analysis of the sales force. So that's where the sales force analysis comes into picture. And in here, mind you, I'm not talking about the technical aspects of your product or offering, which is definitely required. It is given. What I'm talking about is the skills which are required for selling. End-to-end selling, right from whether you call it suspecting to a closure. So there are different facets of selling. So is your sales team equipped with elements of selling? So that's where this sales team SWOT analysis is very, very important. Once you have identified where the gaps are, that's where you come up with a module or training module or a capsule which is specifically customized for your sales team. Now this is very important. It is, even though it is elemental and fundamental, it is very important, but then it is missed out. So that's where you need to get into details of deciphering the qualitative aspect of the sales team. And having said that, why it is important? Because there are no MBAs, there is no school which talks about selling. That's why even today, even if you get enrolled for a master's program in business administration, it talks about marketing management. It doesn't talk about selling, right? So it is very important. And obviously, if there are gaps, if even in quantitative terms, if the team is not enough and we are unable to reach out to the market, then we can talk about having right size team, as in you can talk about having people on board. So that's where the sales team SWOT analysis or this particular internal driver comes into picture. With that, we move on to the next part. I presume that we are moving at a speed which is palatable to everyone. If you have any questions, I would encourage all of you to raise your hands. There is this wonderful feature in front of your screen. You can raise your hand and ask questions as well as we progress. And obviously, we'll have a question answer session at the end of this discussion as well. Right, so with that, I will move on to the next driver, which is the sales team alignment. Now, mind you, till now, I have not spoken about the attitude of the sales team, which comes in a little later. This particular driver talks about how aligned my sales team is towards the goal, which are already set by the management or the organization. So here, that's where it is important to have a proper org structure for the sales team, the organization structure for the sales team, the hierarchy, who's going to report to whom and what he or she is going to report. Once that structure is very clear to everyone, it should not be only on paper, but then it should be communicated to all the sales team. So that's where your entire sales mechanism and machinery would be lubricated and it would be running smoothly. That's when you'll be communicating what goals and targets each and every individual has in terms of whether you call it daily, monthly, quarterly, annual. All of that bifurcation can be done. Considering all the seasonal elements, if we have any, all the seasonality elements we need to consider as well. There are several month-end, year-end syndromes. So all of those considering, we communicate those goals where it is aligned to the top management or the top goal. And that's where you design a very objective reward and recognition or a performance management system. So that's where it is going to impact the attitude of the sales team. Unless and until you answer what is in it for me, it would be very difficult to achieve accelerated growth. And it has to be a mutual win-win, whether it is the sales team or your dealer distributor network or your customer. So how do you design a mechanism which is objective, transparent, and it is addressing everybody's need? So that's where this alignment aspect is extremely important. And again, which is an internal driver, which is within the organization that one can address, right? So with that, we move on to the next and the last driver, which is very important, sales management. Typically, what happens in a process is this sales management element is not given due importance. So even if I'm a sales rep and I've closed let's say I've closed a deal, I should look at closing it in terms of whether it is handed over in terms of to the delivery or delivery team, or whether if I'm talking about a product, whether the product is fulfilling the requirement of the client. So that's where the customer service element comes into picture, which is very important, and one needs to consider that. Like for example, if I were to take a very simple yet powerful example, yesterday I was talking to one of the hotel chains, and they were highlighting the importance of customer service. It goes as fundamental as assuming that you're checking in or checking out of the hotel, and you're required to fill up some details while checking in or checking out. As a customer, if you are a regular visitor at that particular hotel, you would be upset that you are asking the same information again and again. It might sound very trivial, but then another hotel down the lane has improved their processes and they are not asking those details because those system details are already fed into the CRM, right? So now that I've touched upon this element of having a proper and a robust CRM, it could be a software platform, it could be as fundamental as an Excel spreadsheet, but then there has to be a mechanism to address customer service, which obviously is going to take care of the retention also. With this particular information, that's where you get into the next piece, which is very important in terms of measuring the performance. So if I were to quote Peter Drucker, who has been talking about this measurement aspect, if you want to improve it, you need to measure it. So measuring the right matrix is very, very important. So that's where whether you're measuring number of calls made, number of visits made, number of customers touched, it is up to you to decide what is going to work for your industry, your organization, and your sales mechanism. Finally, it is, if I were to go into further details and comment on that, obviously it is much more important and value adding if I'm talking about measuring revenue generated or value generated per customer, per touch point, per day. All of those customizing and tweaking is very important, but then finally it should talk about results as well as processes. So there are results KPIs that you are going to monitor and measure. At the same time, there are those process parameters as well. So depending on your industry, you need to identify what is going to work for you and what is it which is important. So obviously these elements are going to help you in terms of whether the logistics plan, whether you have, once you have sold the product, how are you going to ensure that the product reaches to the customer, whether the financial planning as in the closing the entire deal in terms of realization, revenue realization is also done. So that is part of the sales management. So putting all of this together, this is what we mean by a robust sales growth framework, which is split into two. You have an external driver set. You have on the left what you are internal drivers. So each of the element in itself is a detailed subject. It's going to take a long time for me to go into detail of each and every subject. In due course, we will schedule different sessions to go into each and every driver. Right? Today, as I was talking to you about that, I am going to leave you with some actionable points, at least one key takeaway. So if you ask me, in the course of past 20-30 minutes, what we have done is we have touched upon some elements, like for example, identifying the right market opportunity. We have also identified the importance of having your product placed at the right time, at the right points. One of the very fundamental things, whether you are in a B2B, B2C product or service industry, is how do you ensure that your features are translated into the advantage and benefits for your customer, right? So what we'll do is with that, we'll move on to a couple of live cases that I would want to discuss with you. Right, so I understand that there are a couple of questions. What I'll do is I'll take those questions once I finish this cases. I'll definitely take 2 questions. I can see them on the screen. Yeah, here. So when we are talking about this particular wonderful case that we have delivered, we have been working with a leading FMCG company, which is into growing, processing, and packing high quality tea. They have been catering not only in the country, they have been exporting as well. So this is where this sales growth framework has been applied, and it has reaped wonderful results over the course of 9 months. What you see on the screen are results delivered in 9 months. One thing I'm sure all of you would appreciate, that tea industry is such an industry that it is showing negative growth rate. So globally, the tea industry is shrinking. But even in such scenario, with the help of the sales growth framework, we were able to curtail the dropping market share of this particular client. So whatever was achieved, at least that was sustained, and then we moved on to growing it further. So market share, curtailing the dropping of market share was done. Very importantly, if you go into further details, when I am into an FMCG business, obviously there are new products which are coming into the market, which I'm rolling out based on the taste of the market. In this particular case, the new product sales was somewhere around 0.8%, which rose to 2.9% of the total sales which the organization was doing. Obviously, over the course of this particular exercise, as I was mentioning to you in terms of what my sales strategy should be, which regions I'm going to approach, where my product should be present in terms of placement. So that's where we identified the counties where the team was, as in the product was finding it difficult to sustain. Obviously, there were counties which were doing wonderfully well. But at the same time, those weak counties were identified, and this sales growth framework was worked upon there. So the overall sales in those counties went up by 85%. So you can imagine the kind of value it generates when it is rolled out in a structured manner, right? So with that, I'll go on to the second case. If you remember, I was talking to you about the processed chicken company. That's another leading FMCG company which is into multiple business. So whether that is processed chicken, fresh, frozen, whether that is eggs, poultry equipment, animal feed. So there, it's kind of a different entities of the group into different businesses, but then all of them are finally related to poultry business. So in here, we work with all their different units, whether that is in terms of improving the cost aspect. I will be talking about the sales front. So this deliverables, what you see on the screens, were delivered in a span of 11 months. I've just picked few which are relating to sales and which are tangible. Obviously, there was a whole gamut of softer elements which were delivered as well. So in here, the fresh and frozen chicken sales rose by 150%. So as I was talking to you about, from 20%, which it was a capacity utilization, that went up to as high as 80 to 90%. Obviously, when I'm talking to you about the feed sales, it needs a different approach, which was again contoured by the sales growth framework, which was talking about how do I ensure the right dealer distributor network is there, how do I ensure that they are motivated enough. So designing all those incentive plans for the dealer and distributors. Here, why this 30% is very important, because I also have new entrants into the market in the feed business. How am I going to address them as well? So this sales growth framework comes in very handy when we are talking about addressing and approaching the market and increasing our sales, accelerating the entire process. And obviously, in the course of this particular journey, overall client base went up by 35%. This was across the region. So what you need to do is you need to identify what driver is going to work for you in this sales growth framework. Where is it that you need real input and you need to work upon, right? So with that, I would say we conclude this session of sales growth framework. I wanted to introduce this beautiful concept of sales growth framework such that you can pick from this particular sales growth framework and implement at least one solution into your sales machinery, which will change the way you look at selling, right? So on a closing note, I would want to quote JP Morgan, which says the first step towards getting somewhere is to decide you are not going to stay where you are. So today, let's make that decision that you're not going to stay where you are. You're going to increase the speed of selling. You are going to accelerate the overall sales process. So on that note, let me take those questions which were raised during the course of this discussion. The first question I have is from Mr. Piyush. Hello, Piyush. Your question I would read out. You represent Ayurvedic manufacturing company, as an Ayurvedic medicine manufacturing organization. Your question is, will you be selling on our behalf or only supporting us? Well, what will be your role? Okay, now here, this is a very interesting question. Thank you, Piyush. When we are talking about this, rolling out this sales growth framework, we are talking about acting as a catalyst in the entire process. So the actual selling, the actual game has to be played by your team on the ground, because we would want to ensure that once the consulting team, once the sales support is out, your internal team has to take over and ensure that this accelerated growth is sustained as well. So that is one of the core fundamental requirement as well. So it is to enable the entire system that it sustains even without the consulting support. So initially, obviously, it would be kind of a build, operate, and transfer mechanism where our consulting team would be working with you to roll out this sales growth framework. But then finally, it has to be run by your team, right? So and I think that's the way it should be. So it's like the game has to be played by the real players. The consulting team, the Faber team would be working as coaches to operationalize the entire sales growth framework, ensuring that you take the right buttons as you progress, right? Trust I have answered your question. I move on to the next one. Again, we have this question from Mr. Swapnil, who comes from a pharma industry. I understand that we have a lot of people from pharma background today. So the question is, how can this framework help in pharma industry? Okay, wonderful. Now, as I mentioned to you, Swapnil, that this framework is applicable across different industries. It doesn't matter whether you're in B2B, B2C segment. Now, before I answer this question, Swapnil, I will have to understand from you in terms of what industry do you represent, whether you're talking about selling it to the customer, whether you're talking about B2B sales, whether you're talking about API formulation. I would want to understand further before I make a comment. What I would encourage all of you, if you have any further questions, you can reach out to the coordinates which are mentioned on the screen. We would be very happy to answer any of your questions which are relating to sales growth framework, which are not relating to sales growth framework as well. We would be very happy to add value into your process of increasing the sales. We would be happy to accelerate the entire sales process. Okay, wonderful. I have Swapnil, who is further elaborating the question, who says that whenever I call people in regards of pitching the sales, they tend to disconnect the call. What should I do? Okay, interesting, Swapnil. We have been getting these questions when I talk to several sales professionals, that we are facing trouble in terms of converting those sales calls. Now in here, one thing we'll have to be very aware about, Swapnil, is over the phone, what are you communicating to your client or your customer? So again, I'll go back and quote all our coaches. If you pick up any sales coach, they will be talking about over the phone. You're not selling the product or offering. What you're selling is a meeting. So selling a meeting over the phone should be your objective. So how are you going to sell a meeting? That's for you to design a very well drafted communication pitch, which talks about what feature your product or offering has and how you're going to customize it to address the benefits and advantages for your customer. So I presume that would answer your question briefly. Obviously, we can have a detailed round of discussion if you get in touch with us or the coordinates which are mentioned. So on that note, what I would want to do is I would want to thank all of you again from the bottom of my heart for making it today, for today's webinar. And I trust that this webinar on sales growth framework was value adding, and you would be able to take at least one takeaway which you would be implementing. We would be very glad to have your feedback on the webinar and the approach and the takeaways. So please do write to us. I would also want to thank the team which put together this webinar, wonderful webinar today. And in time to come, we look forward to hosting you on another subject, another topic which creates value, which creates growth opportunities for the entire ecosystem. Thank you so much.